So next up, we will hear from a diverse group of experts on how to best find a framework for consensus when it comes to environment-forward solutions. For more on that, I'm pleased to welcome on stage Kyle Isakauer, Vice President of Regulatory and Economic Policy at the American Petroleum Institute, Melissa Lavinson, Senior Vice President for Government and External Affairs at Pepco Holdings, an Exelon company, Glenn Prickett, Chief External Affairs Officer, at the Nature Conservancy, and Jane Flagle, Program Officer for Environment at the Bernard and Ann Spitzer Charitable Trust. Jason Grumet, the founder and president of the Bipartisan Policy Center, will be leading this conversation. Jason, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, and to all your colleagues at the Hill for putting this together. Also, a real appreciation to Senator Whitehouse and Congressman Fitzpatrick, both for the work that they've done, but also really giving us a foundation for what I think is going to be a very interesting kind of 20-minute lightning round of engagement. Just to kind of sharpen the premise a moment, I think the panel, I hope, will kind of drill down on this question about whether there are some cracks that are starting to form in what has been the 20-year polarization over the climate debate. And while we are clearly eyes wide open, recognize that one of the people who still doubts climate science happens to be the leader of the free world, recognize that there is an energetic movement behind the leave it in the ground concept. At the same time, whether it's the slow drip of science, whether it has been the careening federal policy, or maybe just sheer exhaustion, it seems to us at the Bipartisan Policy Center that the science denial, economic denial, engineering denial that has really kind of forced us into polarized tribes for the last couple decades is starting potentially to diminish. And so I think that's what we're going to try to check in on, and I'm going to ask everybody to basically kind of dish on their own constituencies to test that question. Just a note about process before we get going. The ethos of the Bipartisan Policy Center is to bring together people who have great expertise, strong, stubborn principle, and intense economic and spiritual and personal interests in these outcomes. Our goal is to have then a kind of real constructive collision of ideas, but we also think in order for that collision to be meaningful, everyone's interests need to be well understood. And so it is, I think, important for me to indicate that the Bipartisan Policy Center has a financial relationship with every single member of this panel. Exelon and PG&E have been on our Leaders Council for a long time. We are very delighted to be a grantee of the Spitzer Foundation. And Glenn, you may not know this, but we actually funded TNC several years ago. So it is with that kind of collision of expertise and collaboration that I want to kick this off, and maybe Melissa, start out with you. You have obviously been in the crucible of the issues around resilience and adaptation. To what extent do you think that this kind of 10 plagues of storms and fire and hail, everything except frogs raining from the sky,
that's going to be next week.
That's next. Rosh Hashanah is coming up. Is that starting, do you think, to in a meaningful way influence the debate on the Hill?
So thanks, Jason, and again, thanks for PG&E and National Grid for putting this on, and for the Hill for having us all here today. So I think your question is a really good one, and I do think that we are seeing a change in dialogue. I do think we are seeing a change in the public conscience on climate change, on what it means, on its impact. I think real life events are occurring, and it's impacting real people. And when we have that confluence of what we're seeing in California, what we saw in Houston, what we saw in Puerto Rico, and even what we see up and down the East Coast in terms of the storms that we saw this March coming through the Northeast. We had Quinn, Riley, Toby. When you see that confluence of events, people start to recognize, and people start to ask questions. And they ask questions not just of themselves and not just of their local policymakers or state policymakers, but I think they ask those questions of their federal policymakers as well. And I think as we heard the previous congressman as well as the senator, that they're getting these questions from their constituents, and they're also actually having those dialogues. They're having those dialogues with their voters, and it's resonating. And so I do think that we are on the cusp of having, I think, a broader awareness. of the impacts, and so that I think that means for business, particularly a business like ours, which is a critical infrastructure company, we have a responsibility. We have a responsibility to consider that in our planning. We have a responsibility to consider that as we advance policies, and we have a responsibility to really do something about it today.
And is it fair to say that the conversation about the costs of climate change is a little bit less theoretical for your ratepayers today than it might have been a year ago?
I think that there's always a balance between costs and benefits, right? And you always have to look at the affordability of any investment that you're going to make. And I think what's really important and something that I think we live by as an industry is we recognize, right, that if it's not affordable, it's not sustainable. And so when you're looking at making those policies and making those investments, you can invest for mitigation. And you can invest for resilience at the same time. And I think that's where we have to see things come together, particularly in the energy sector right now. And the good news is it's an exciting time, right? We're going through a transformational moment. The future of energy is here. And the future of energy recognizes that we have a climate challenge. And we have technologies that can really decarbonize the sector. In fact, they exist today. We have nuclear, we have renewables, and we have those other transformational technologies on the generation side. We have the technology on the distribution side, and we're seeing that confluence of events of energy technology, information technology, and transportation technology coming together at such an awesome time that the future is now. So what we need to do is figure out how can we work together to take advantage of it.
So Glenn, as the representative of the entire environmental community, Senator Whitehouse spoke about and has been a leader of a number of efforts that really kind of broaden the solution set. Advanced nuclear work with Senator Inhofe, his work with Senators Heitkamp and Barrasso, Capito on carbon sequestration, investments in coal technology. You have joined the Carbon Capture Coalition. TNC has joined that coalition. So, in this kind of Twitter-free, cone of silence, how's that going, right? I mean, talk a little bit about the, I think, kind of constructive tensions within the environmental community about whether the kind of renewables and energy efficiency can get us their strategy versus this broader strategy. How's that playing out?
Sure. Thank you, Jason. And I also want to start by thanking the Hill and Bipartisan Policy Project and PG&E and National Grid for bringing us all together. I first came to DC 30 years ago, and what I now realize were the waning days of a real bipartisan ethos. So conversations like this morning, I think for a lot of us are really energizing and inspiring, so thank you for that. And I do think there is a bipartisan way forward. So Jason, you asked about the Carbon Capture Coalition, which the Nature Conservancy has joined. And we see that as a great example of a very practical bipartisan solution, not the only solution, but an important solution to climate change. And I'll come back to the specifics of that in just a moment, but I think in general, what we see at the Nature Conservancy, we work in 70 countries around the world, all 50 states across the United States. Here in the US, we have very strong supporters who are Republicans, who are Democrats, who are independents. And across the board, what we see is a real hunger and interest in solutions to the climate problem that make economic sense for those communities. So bringing the climate issue out of the atmosphere and down to earth, where we can do practical things that reduce pollution but also create jobs and boost economies. So we were pleased to join the Carbon Capture Coalition because it's one of those solutions. It's a practical set of measures that companies are taking now to capture carbon from fossil-fired electricity generation, sometimes store it underground, but the more exciting opportunity is to use that captured carbon for economically productive activities. And it's really unlocked some bipartisan cooperation in the Congress. So probably everybody in this room knows it, but a lot of people didn't recognize that in this past year's budget bill, the Future Act was included, which creates a tax incentive for carbon capture and utilization or storage. That was co-sponsored by Senator Whitehouse, whom we just heard from. Probably not a huge surprise, although he took some risks on the left side of the environmental community, but also strongly by Senator Barrasso from Wyoming. At the Nature Conservancy, we bring all of our trustees from across the country to Washington every year. We had them here in June. We did almost 300 meetings up on the Hill, Republicans and Democrats. I joined the delegations to the coal states. So I met with Senator Barrasso, I met with Senator Heitkamp from North Dakota, I met with Senator Manchin from West Virginia, all very strong champions of this measure. Senator Barrasso came to our Carbon Capture Coalition meeting the next week. A few of us were there and said publicly that the time for the debate about the carbon problem is over. We have practical solutions. We need to get on with it. So if we can identify a set of climate solutions that make good economic sense for constituencies in members' districts and states, I think we really can build some bipartisan support. We won't get everything we need in the short run, but we can begin building some solutions and gain momentum over time.
So just to follow up, so no community is monolithic, but I think it's fair to say that the majority of the environmental community would not join the Carbon Capture Coalition today, that there's still a very strong, beyond coal, even beyond gas, a premise that we can get to the end zone with primarily renewable technologies. Is that becoming a meaningful debate within the community?
So I work for the Nature Conservancy. I believe in biological diversity. I also believe in political and ideological diversity. It creates a healthy debate. So yeah, not every organization in the environmental community supports the idea of carbon capture, but that's okay. We challenge each other. We make our views clearer, and that's part of the democratic process, trying to figure out what solutions are actually going to work scientifically, politically, economically.
So Jane, the Spitzer Foundation is a reasonably new entrant into the climate funding world. You are somewhat unique in the philanthropic world in that you have an actual PhD in a scientific endeavor.
And I used to work for you.
See, I was going to keep that out of it, but now that we're all sharing, talk a little bit about the Spitzer Foundation's kind of goals. And I mean, I think you're really trying to occupy a bit of a niche in climate philanthropy. Say more.
So I think this relates to what Glenn was just talking about. I think for a whole range of reasons, we're seeing some cracks in the sort of denialism that you teased out across the political spectrum. I think there are for a few reasons, the environmental and climate advocacy community broadly defined is at a bit of an inflection point, recognizing that while tremendous strides have been made in renewable technologies, including the growth in renewables, but also declines in costs over time, all of the state renewable portfolio standards, that philanthropy played a significant role in driving forward, we are nowhere near where we need to be in terms of the effective management of climate risk. And I think that's kind of a broadly shared view across much of the climate advocacy community. For example, the most recent IPCC assessment report, in order to get to the temperature targets that international negotiators agreed upon, so limiting warming to 2 degrees, almost all of the scenarios that got us there assumed wide-scale deployment of technologies that just don't exist today at meaningful scale. And I think that that has also driven the conversation in some ways in some productive direction. So the Spitzer Trust, in the face of this, is of the view that from a technology and also from a political perspective, robust risk management in the face of a really complex problem like climate change suggests that diversification of the zero carbon technology options that we have is the right path forward. There's just too much uncertainty. And at the Spitzer Trust, I think our view is that we're not willing to put all of our eggs in one technology category basket. And so it just so happens that widening the aperture on the solution set, both just in terms of mitigation, but also in terms of looking at the climate problem holistically to include things like addressing committed climate risk through adaptation and resilience. If you have a larger solution set, it's more likely that you're going to be able to get a plurality of interests to agree on at least some pieces of the solution set. There's this great quote by Walter Lippmann who said, the role of politics in a democracy is not to get people who think differently to think alike, but to get people who think differently to act alike. And I think that's one of the philosophies that underpins the Trust's approach, both in our innovation work and in our new exploratory work on adaptation in the US.
So totally stealing that quote.
I stole it from someone else.
Of course. So the follow-up to you is a little bit similar to what I asked Glenn. Having spent a little bit of time petitioning and genuflecting before philanthropy in the last 10 hours and 10 years, there seems to me to be a little bit of a heart-brain disconnect. I think very, very smart people share your premise that there's simply, the math says you can't get this done absent broad set of technologies, including nuclear. But culturally, that's just seems really hard. A lot of environmental community and climate philanthropy actually kind of came up through the anti-nuclear movement. How rich is this debate right now in philanthropy? I say rich.
Rich. No, I mean, I think it's a very significant part of an ongoing conversation. And look, you know, one piece of widening the aperture in philanthropy on climate is not just shifting the minds or the hearts, I guess, in this case, of those who have been deeply committed to a climate for a long time, but also building out a new set of constituencies who can care about climate, who might be open to zero carbon technology options that would be challenging for some folks on the further left of the climate advocacy spectrum. And I think, you know, with the climate math suggests and robust risk management suggests that we need everything we can find, and building out a new set of constituencies. Between those two strategies, I think that you can imagine creating the space for a different kind of climate movement.
Everybody is so diplomatic. Isn't that awesome? So I want to ask Kyle a couple questions, but then just give folks a little head lowering that we're going to open it up to the audience. You know, Kyle, I guess there's a lot of careening right now in the energy space. I think you know, the kind of magical arrival of natural gas just when we needed it has fundamentally changed a lot of the economics. The remarkable whiplash from the Obama to the Trump administration on policy seems to have shocked some people towards a pragmatic center. You know, how is that influencing the diversity of players that API represents?
Well, certainly within our industry, there's a diverse thought, diverse range of opinions in terms of climate policy. We all agree that the risk of climate change is significant and it's a serious issue that should be addressed. And as a group, our focus, frankly, is on identifying the ability to make reductions today. So rather than trying to focus on a policy solution at this point, especially in this very divided political climate, if you will, it makes more sense to let's focus on how we can achieve those carbon reductions today. And we're doing it through natural gas, as you mentioned, and I think our host from the grid also mentioned that you know, most of the reductions that we're seeing right now, and we are at 25-year lows in terms of carbon emissions here in the United States, that is being driven primarily by fuel switching in the utility sector from coal to natural gas. In fact, 60% of that reduction we've seen in the utility sector has come from fuel switching to natural gas. So we're focused on achieving those reductions, but we also believe that there's a need to reduce our own emissions, and we've reduced our own emissions in the oil and gas industry. In 2016 alone, a recent report identified that we reduced 57 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent in 2016 alone, year over year from 2015. And to give some perspective on that, that is the equivalent carbon that would be sequestered by 5 billion trees, billion with a B, 10-year-old trees, conifer trees. So you're talking about a significant amount of carbon that we've reduced just in one year. And then, of course, I think the real answer long-term is technology. And I think a number of people have already talked about technology development. And the oil and gas industry feels that we have a part to play in there as well. In fact, other than the federal government, no other industry sector has invested more since 2000 than the oil and gas sector. In fact, the next closest sector is less than half of the investment in zero and low carbon technologies that the oil and gas sector has invested. So we think there's a comprehensive look at this. We think technology is important. Obviously, natural gas is very important to reducing carbon emissions. But from a policy perspective, I think the political climate just isn't there to make that happen right now. So let's just focus on solutions in terms of reducing emissions today.
So in terms of my last, probably unsuccessful attempt to pick a fight within a family, you mentioned the political climate. The point of a trade association is to keep diverse members together, which is no easy feat. But now some of your members are starting to actually lobby for carbon pricing, and some of your members are nowhere near that position. How does an association like API address that?
Well, we address it by focusing on principles of legislation. So We don't have a policy position that we are espousing in terms of moving forward. However, we certainly know certain principles that would be that are appropriate to consider in terms of carbon legislation, whatever that legislation might be. So we're looking at those principles, and we evaluate each, any specific proposal based on, on some of those legislative principles that we as an industry all agree on.
All right, so we have time for a few questions. We have fleet-footed mic runners, and I see a hand in the back. Let us know who you are, please.
Hi, excuse me. My name is Patrick Carolyn. I'm the Executive Director of the Franciscan Action Network, and I'm the co-founder of the Global Catholic Climate Movement. So it's great that we're talking about climate solutions. One sector that nobody seems to be talking about, though, is the workers. And so we've formed a coalition with a number of faith communities and also are working with some of the power companies around just transition. And I think we have to keep in mind, it's easy. My friends in the green industry all talk about and show charts and graphs about how many green jobs were created, but that's irrelevant to people who work at a power plant in Minnesota, a coal-fired power plant that's shutting down, or coal miners in West Virginia and those communities. So how do we and can we ensure that all of the discussions around climate solution include not leaving the workers in those industries behind?
So, Melissa, can I pitch that to you? Because I know you, both in your prior job and current, work in an industry where some major facilities are closing down with a lot of lead time. How does Pepco and Exelon think about that question?
Sure. So I do think that's a really important question. I mean, when you think about it, and you think about, for example, a nuclear plant, which is a zero carbon resource that provides power 24/7. They're about 400 to 700, up to 1,000, 1,200 folks that work at that facility. That's a lot of jobs, and so Pepco Exelon. We're very supportive, obviously, of keeping those facilities open. We think it's the right thing to do, not only for the communities, but also for the climate. And I think we just heard earlier, right? We have a lot of ground to make up in terms of really getting our carbon reductions where we need them to be and getting there as quickly as possible. And we believe we should use every existing resource, and nuclear is a huge part of that. In terms of transition, recognize that some of those facilities have already scheduled to shut down, and that is a really big issue. And what are we going to do in terms of transitioning workers into other fields? And again, if you look at the energy industry, there's the other piece of that, which is the infrastructure side. And there's a lot of build out that needs to happen in infrastructure. Transmission, distribution, energy storage, new power generating facilities. There is a lot of work to be had. And what we need to do is figure out how we can transition folks from the jobs they have to the jobs that we know are going to exist. So what's the training that we need? What are the resources that we need to support that? And we need to build in the time to do that. We know in our industry that we are going to need to hire thousands and tens of thousands of workers over the next, say, 5 to 10 years, but we need those workers to have the right skills. So we think a workforce piece of that, a training piece of that, a skills development piece is just absolutely critical, and we're doing that at Pepco Exelon. We're doing that as an industry, and we're happy to work with anyone who wants to work with us on that.
I think we can sneak another question under the wire.
Hi, my name is Michelle Chow, and I'm also a student at the George Washington University. Awesome. So I know that you're saying in each of your respective industries that you're kind of making these changes towards mitigation and resilience. However, there are definitely other companies within these sectors that obviously aren't as eager to make these changes. And besides sort of these long-term economic benefits, there's no real incentives right now, especially with the Trump administration proposing these budget cuts to the EPA and certain groups like the IRIS, which is sort of making these counterweights to industry's research with these environmental impacts. And so I was kind of wondering what each of your companies or organizations is doing to kind of put pressure on these companies to make these changes.
All right, let's 2 or 3 of you.
Yeah, I think spectacular question, and thank you for not only the question, but being here and being passionate about the issue. So I think you just made the really strong argument why we need a national policy to accelerate adoption of clean energy and sustainable land use and other climate solutions. So I first want to salute Congressman Fitzpatrick, Congressman Curbelo, the other members of the Bipartisan Climate Solutions Caucus for bringing forward the Market Choice Act, because it's smart policy that would put a price on carbon, reinvest the proceeds in the country's infrastructure. But as you say, leading companies like those here are pushing themselves toward the clean energy future, but not every company is. So rather than go at those companies one at a time, which won't succeed fast enough, we need a policy that really drives everyone faster toward a clean energy future, and a carbon price is the most efficient way to do that. So what I would say to everyone here, especially for you and your fellow students at GW and other schools, you need to be back in your communities, talking to your neighbors, talking to your elected officials about why we need a policy to drive the country faster toward a clean energy future.
And just one
Final
thing
thoughts?
I do want to just say, I recognize that we're kind of at a stasis maybe at the federal level a bit, although we are seeing cracks in movement. But there's a lot of activity at the state level going on all across the country, and so don't discount that. In fact, I would encourage people to get even more engaged at the state level, and to encourage actually states and regions to work together. I think when you take those regional approaches, we can get so much more done. And if you really think about it, 19 states now have some sort of legislative authority around reducing carbon intensity or reducing overall carbon emissions. That's about a third of the national GDP. That's huge from an economic driver perspective. So when you look at that, if you can get those states to really work together to think about regional solutions, we can really make tremendous advancements and do it in a way that's really rational, pragmatic, and extremely, I think, affordable.
Skylar, Jane, any final thought to share?
Sure, I'd say I don't think you should discount the desire for industry to make advancements on their own without necessarily policy driving it. I talked before about the investments in zero and low carbon technologies that my industry has made since 2000. That's $108 billion is what they've invested since 2000 in these technologies. They didn't do that because there was a policy driving them to do that. They did that because they want to remain part of our energy future. So I think that there is a strong financial incentive for all industries, including oil and gas, to make those investments and to continue to develop new technologies that are going to be more prevalent as we go further.
I think, over the long term, what you're hearing from everyone on the panel is that there is a role for a robust public sector in helping to address climate risk. I think, are there things that can be done now to start to build the political foundation and the trust that's going to be needed to create bipartisan and therefore durable climate policy at the federal level moving forward?
So I want to thank our panel for their clear-eyed and somewhat optimistic imagination of collaboration around this incredible challenge.